They called her a gold digger. They called her a temporary fixture. When billionaire tycoon Arthur Sterling died suddenly, his entire family sharpened their knives, ready to cut his young, pregnant wife Kylie out of the picture completely. The sharks gathered in the mahogany-paneled library of the Sterling estate, expecting a slaughter. They expected Arthur to humiliate her one last time from the grave. And he did. But what they didn't know was that Arthur's ridicule was actually a code, a trap laid out for the greedy, and a key to a secret that would bring the entire Sterling empire to its knees. You think you know how a will reading ends? You haven't heard this one yet. The rain over Greenwich, Connecticut didn't wash away the grime of the day. It only seemed to press the humidity and the tension closer to the earth. At 440 Fairview Avenue, the iron gates of the Sterling Manor stood locked, guarding the secrets inside the sprawling limestone estate that Arthur Sterling had built with ruthless aggression over 40 years. Inside the grand salon, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume. It was the post-funeral reception, but it felt more like a corporate merger gone wrong. Kylie Sterling sat in the corner, her hands resting protectively over her 7-month pregnant belly. She wore a simple black dress purchased off the rack 3 years ago, which now strained slightly against her swollen figure. She looked nothing like the other women in the room. Women like Victoria Sterling, her stepdaughter-in-law, who was currently sipping vintage champagne and whispering loudly enough for Kylie to hear. "I give it a week before she's back in whatever trailer park Arthur plucked her from," Victoria said, smoothing her Chanel skirt. "Honestly, it's embarrassing. Look at her. She looks like the help." Julian Sterling, Arthur's eldest son and presumed heir to the Sterling oil and tech conglomerate, chuckled darkly. He was a man of 45, with his father's sharp nose, but none of his father's business acumen. "Don't worry, darling. The prenup was ironclad. Arthur might have gone soft in his old age, marrying a nurse, but he wasn't senile. She gets a stipend, maybe a condo, and she disappears. The real assets stay with the blood." Kylie kept her eyes on the floor. She had been Arthur's palliative care nurse 3 years ago. They had fallen in love in the quiet moments between his treatments. The Arthur she knew wasn't the bull of Wall Street. He was a frightened, lonely man who regretted sacrificing his family relationships for money. But when he went into remission and married her, his family declared war. "Water." Kylie looked up. It was Martha, the head housekeeper, holding a crystal glass. Martha was the only person in the house who didn't look at Kylie with disdain. "Thank you, Martha," Kylie whispered. "Don't let them get to you, Mrs. Sterling," Martha murmured, pretending to adjust a napkin. "Mr. Sterling did things his own way, always. I just want this to be over," Kylie admitted, her voice trembling. "They hate me, Martha, and they hate this baby." "They hate what they can't control," Martha said, glancing toward Julian. "And Julian has been trying to control his father's money since he was 18. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the salon banged open. The room went silent. Entering the room was Elias Thorne, senior partner at Thorne, Weathers & Associates, the most feared law firm in the tri-state area. He was followed by 2 paralegals carrying metallic briefcases that looked heavy enough to contain gold bars. Thorne was a man who didn't smile. He had served Arthur Sterling for 30 years, burying the billionaire's secrets as efficiently as he filed his taxes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thorne's voice grated like gravel. "The reception is over. The reading of the last will and testament of Arthur James Sterling will commence in the library in 10 minutes. Attendance is mandatory for all named parties." He looked directly at Julian, then at Beatrice Arthur's daughter, a socialite who had flown in from Milan that morning, and finally his gaze landed on Kaylee. For a second, Kaylee thought she saw a flicker of pity in the lawyer's cold grey eyes. Or perhaps it was a warning. "That includes you, Mrs. Sterling," Thorne said. Julian scoffed, draining his glass. "Come on then. Let's go see how much Dad charged us for the privilege of being his children." As Kaylee struggled to stand, clutching the armrest for support, no one offered a hand. She took a deep breath, feeling the baby kick against her ribs. "I have to be strong," she told herself. "For the baby." She didn't know that walking into that library was about to destroy the life she knew. The library was a cavernous room lined with first editions that nobody in the family had ever read. A massive portrait of Arthur Sterling hung above the fireplace. In the painting, he stood with his hand on a globe, looking like a conqueror. The seating arrangement was deliberate. Julian, Victoria, and Beatrice sat on the plush leather Chesterfield sofa to the right. They looked like a united front, a wall of expensive fabric and disdain. Kaylee was directed to a single, stiff-backed wooden chair on the opposite side of the room, facing them. It felt like an interrogation. Mr. Thorne sat at Arthur's massive desk. He unlocked the briefcases with a distinct click-clack that echoed in the silence. He pulled out a thick document and a sleek, black, encrypted hard drive. "Before we begin," Thorne said, "I must remind you that Arthur Sterling updated his will 3 days before his passing." A gasp went through the room. 3 days. Julian stood up, his face reddening. He was on heavy morphine. He wasn't in his right mind. "I'll contest this before the ink is dry." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Thorne said, his voice calm but dangerous. Dr. Eris Thorne, a neutral third-party psychiatrist, certified Arthur's competency an hour before the signing. The video logs are time-stamped and irrefutable. If you contest, you trigger the no contest clause, which strips you of every single dime. Do you want to take that gamble? Julian's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He slowly sat back down, glaring at Kaylee. She made him do it. She whispered poison in his ear while he was dying. "I did no such thing," Kaylee said softly. "I didn't even know he changed it." "Silence," Thorne commanded. "We will proceed." Thorne began to read the legalese. It started with the standard distributions. "To my loyal staff, Martha Higgins, $100,000. Martha, standing by the door, stifled a sob. "To my chauffeur James, $50,000. The list went on. The staff was taken care of generously. Julian drummed his fingers on his knee, impatient. These were crumbs. He was waiting for the billions. And now... Thorne paused, looking over his spectacles. "To my children." Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "To my daughter Beatrice," Thorne read, "who has never worked a day in her life and treats money like water. I leave the villa in Tuscany and a monthly allowance of $20,000, contingent on her passing a random drug test quarterly." Beatrice shrieked. "$20,000? That won't even cover my stylist and a drug test. This is humiliation." "And to my son Julian," Thorne continued, his voice raising over Beatrice's complaints. "To Julian, who has spent 20 years waiting for me to die, so he could dismantle my company." Julian froze. "I leave the Sterling Manhattan penthouse, my collection of vintage Jaguars, and a seat on the board of directors. However, you are stripped of your title as CEO, effective immediately. You will receive no controlling stock." The silence that followed was deafening. Julian looked like he had been shot. "No stock," Julian whispered. "Who gets the stock? Who gets the company?" That's worth $4 billion. Thorne turned the page slowly. We will get to the assets. But first, Arthur left a specific message regarding his wife. Thorne picked up the hard drive and plugged it into a laptop connected to a large screen behind the desk. Arthur recorded this specifically for this moment, Thorne said. He wanted to address you, Kaylee, personally. Kaylee's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the screen, desperate to see her husband's face one last time. The screen flickered to life. Arthur Sterling appeared. He looked frail, sitting in his hospital bed, breathing with an oxygen tube. But his eyes, those blue steel eyes, were sharp. Kaylee, the video Arthur said. His voice was raspy. I'm here, Arthur, she whispered, tears spilling over. Kaylee, the recording continued. You came into my life when I was dying. You played the part of the doting nurse well. You warmed my bed. You carried my child. Kaylee smiled through her tears, expecting a declaration of love. But then Arthur's face on the screen twisted into a cruel sneer. But did you really think I didn't know? Arthur growled from the screen. Did you think I was a senile old fool who would hand over my empire to a gold-digging nobody from the slums of New Jersey just because she got pregnant? Kaylee's blood ran cold. The room began to spin. Julian and Beatrice exchanged shocked looks. Then slow, malicious smiles spread across their faces. I know what you are, Kaylee, Arthur spat. I know why you married me, and I have made sure that you will be the laughingstock of this family, just as you deserve. The video continued, Arthur's voice growing louder, fueled by a dying man's rage, or perhaps something else. You thought you hit the jackpot, Arthur rasped. You thought you'd be the Dowager Queen of Sterling Industries. Well, here is my bequest to you. On the screen, Arthur held up a single crumpled dollar bill. $1, Arthur said. I leave my wife, Kaylee Sterling, the sum of $1, and... He reached off camera and pulled up a rusty, tarnished old key on a piece of dirty twine. And this key. It opens a storage unit in the Bronx, Unit 4B, at City Keep Storage. Inside you will find everything you are worth. Arthur leaned into the camera lens, his eyes wide and terrifying. Take your dollar, take your junk, and get out of my house. If you are not off the premises within 1 hour of this reading, the security team has instructions to remove you by force. The screen went black. For 3 seconds there was absolute silence in the library. Then Julian exploded into laughter. It was a cruel, barking sound. Oh my God! Beatrice shrieked, clapping her hands. Daddy! You absolute legend. $1. Did you hear that? $1? Victoria leaned over her face, twisted in glee. Unit 4B in the Bronx. Sounds like you're going back home, honey. Kaylee sat frozen. She felt like she had been physically struck. The man she had loved, the man who had cried in her arms about his regrets, the man who had sworn he wanted this baby more than anything. He had played her. It had all been a lie. Mrs. Sterling, Thorne said. His voice was devoid of emotion, but he held out an envelope. This contains your $1 and the key. Kaylee's hands shook so badly she could barely grasp the envelope. She stood up, her legs wobbling. Get out, Julian said, standing up and pointing to the door. You heard him. 1 hour. Pack your trash and get out of my house. Actually, Thorne interrupted. The house remains part of the trust, until the final asset allocation is determined. But given the hostility, Mrs. Sterling, it might be best if you left. Kaylee clutched the envelope to her chest. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at Beatrice. She looked at the portrait of Arthur. "Why?" she whispered. She turned and ran. She ran as fast as a pregnant woman could out of the library, through the salon where the staff stared at her with pity, and out into the pouring rain. She didn't have a car. Julian had ordered the chauffeur not to drive her. She walked down the long driveway, the rain soaking her black dress, shivering, humiliated and heartbroken. She hailed a taxi at the main road, the driver looking at her soaking wet form with suspicion. "Where to, lady?" "The Bronx," she chattered, her teeth clicking. "City Keep Storage." She had to know. She had to know what was in that unit. Was it just trash? Was it a final insult? As the taxi sped away back in the library, Julian was pouring himself a scotch. "Well, that settles that," Julian said, raising his glass. "The witch is gone. Now, Thorne, let's get to the real business. The stock, the $4 billion. Since she gets nothing, it obviously reverts to the next of kin. Me." Thorne sat back in his chair, tenting his fingers. He looked at Julian with an unreadable expression. "Not exactly, Mr. Sterling." Julian froze the glass halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean, not exactly?" Arthur's video message to Kaylee was theatrical, Thorne said, but the legal document is specific. The control of Sterling Industries, the $4 billion, and all real estate holdings are held in a blind trust. "A trust for who?" Beatrice demanded. "For the beneficiary named in the contents of Storage Unit 4B, Thorne said calmly. Julian dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor. "What?" Julian screamed. "You just sent her there. She has the key." "Arthur gave her the key," Thorne corrected. "He didn't say the contents belonged to her. He said she would find what she is worth. If she throws away the key or refuses to go, the trust dissolves and the money goes to charity. If she opens the unit, well, the will stipulates that the person who opens Unit 4B determines the fate of the company." "She's going to the Bronx right now," Julian yelled, grabbing his coat. "We have to beat her there if that unit contains the bearer bonds or the stock certificates, and she gets her hands on them." "She thinks it's trash," Victoria said, her eyes wide with panic. "She might just throw the key away." "Move," Julian roared, shoving past his wife. "Get the car. We're going to the Bronx." Meanwhile, inside the taxi, Kaylee opened the envelope. Inside was a crisp $1 bill and a rusty key, but there was also a small folded piece of paper wrapped around the key. She unfolded it. It was Arthur's handwriting, but it wasn't shaky. It was firm. "Kaylee, if you are reading this, you have survived the worst. I had to do it this way. The wolves were watching. I had to make them think I hated you so they wouldn't kill you to get to the money before I died. But now the game begins. Trust no one but yourself. Go to the unit. What's inside isn't for me. It's for the future." Kaylee stared at the note. The tears stopped. Her grip on the key tightened. Arthur hadn't betrayed her. He had hidden her in plain sight. But as she looked out the rear window, she saw the headlights of a black SUV swerving through traffic, gaining on the taxi fast. It was Julian's Range Rover. They were coming. The taxi driver, a man named Rajiv, who had seen everything in 20 years of driving in Niwai streets, looked in the rearview mirror at the terrified, pregnant woman, and then at the aggressive black Range Rover filling the view. "Lady, you got trouble," Rajiv said, his hands tightening on the wheel. "Please just drive." Kaylee pleaded, clutching the rusty key and Arthur's note so tight her knuckles turned white. "Don't let them stop us. I have $200 cash in my purse. It's yours if you get me to CityKeep storage in the Bronx before them." Rajiv didn't need to be told twice. He slammed on the accelerator, weaving the yellow cab through the rain-slicked traffic of I-95 with a sudden burst of aggressive energy. Behind them, Julian cursed violently, slamming his hand against the steering wheel of the Range Rover. "They're pulling away," Beatrice shrieked from the passenger seat. "Don't lose her, you idiot! That trash she's holding could be the deed to the company." "I'm not going to lose her," Julian snarled, his eyes fixed on the taxi's taillights. He wasn't just chasing money anymore. He was chasing survival. The humiliation of Thorne, telling him he owned nothing, burned in his gut like acid. The chase continued into the tangled highways leading into the Bronx. The rain turned torrentially heavy, blurring the world outside into streaks of grey and neon. Julian drove recklessly, tailgating the taxi, flashing his high beams, trying to intimidate Rajiv into pulling over. But Rajiv, motivated by cash and a sudden protective instinct for his passenger, held his nerve. He took a sharp exit ramp at the last second, tires squealing, leaving Julian momentarily stuck behind a semi-truck before he could force his way across 3 lanes to follow. That small lead was all they needed. 10 minutes later, the taxi skidded to a halt in front of a desolate industrial park, hidden behind a defunct diaper factory. A flickering neon sign buzzed sadly. CityKeep storage. 24 HR access. It was a dismal place. Rows upon rows of corrugated metal doors stretching into the rainy darkness. It looked like a graveyard for forgotten things. Kaylee shoved the cash at Rajiv. "Thank you. Please, you have to go. Don't wait for me." "You sure miss this place. It is not good," Rajiv said, looking nervously at the shadows. "I have to do this alone," she whispered. She stepped out into the deluge. The rain instantly soaked her clothes to her skin, chilling her to the bone. The baby kicked hard, a reminder of the stakes. She looked at the number painted on the asphalt. Row 4. She began to waddle-run down the alleyway between the metal units, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in her ears. She found it. Unit 4B. The padlock on the door was old and caked in grime. Her hands were shaking so violently she dropped the key twice in the mud. As she fumbled to pick it up, she heard the roar of an engine. The Range Rover whipped around the corner, its headlights blinding her, pinning her against the metal door like an insect. Julian and Beatrice leaped out of the car before it even fully stopped. "Get away from that door, Kaylee!" Julian roared, his expensive Italian shoes splashing through the puddles. He looked deranged, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes wild. "It's mine!" Kylie cried out, shielding the lock with her body. "Arthur left it to me. He left you trash," Beatrice yelled, stumbling toward her. "Give us the key, you stupid cow, and we'll give you enough money to disappear forever. Don't open it. You don't know what you're doing." Their panic confirmed it. Mr. Thorne was right. Whatever was inside here, it held the power. With a surge of adrenaline, Kaylee shoved the key into the lock and twisted with all her might. The rusty mechanism groaned and snapped open. "No!" Julian lunged, grabbing Kaylee's shoulder and yanking her backward. She screamed, slipping on the wet asphalt, falling onto her hands and knees. Julian didn't even look at her. He stepped over her, grabbed the handle of the rolling door, and threw it upward with a crash. The 3 of them froze, staring into the cavernous darkness of Unit 4B. The headlights of the Range Rover illuminated the contents. It wasn't stacks of cash. It wasn't gold bars. It was a dusty, chaotic archive of a lifetime. There were hundreds of bankers' boxes stacked precariously high, labeled with dates going back 40 years. In the center of the room sat a worn, ugly green velvet armchair, the chair from Arthur's private study that he had supposedly thrown out years ago because it was too comfortable. And sitting on the seat of the armchair was a sleek modern titanium briefcase. Julian scrambled into the unit, ignoring the dust and cobwebs, making straight for the titanium briefcase. "This is it," he breathed, his greed overtaking his rationality. "The bearer bonds. The offshore accounts. It has to be." He tried to open it. Locked. Biometric fingerprint scanner. "Damn it!" Julian slammed his fist on the case. Kaylee dragged herself up from the muddy ground, leaning against the doorframe, water dripping from her hair. She looked past Julian, past the briefcase, to something sitting on the floor next to the armchair. It was a portable battery-operated projector hooked up to a small media player. And taped to the top of the player was a note in Arthur's handwriting. "Kaylee. Press play. Just one more movie night." A sob caught in her throat. Their movie nights in the hospice room had been their escape. While Julian uselessly pounded on the briefcase, Kaylee walked slowly into the unit. She ignored him, knelt beside the projector, and pressed the power button. A beam of light cut through the dusty air, projecting onto the blank white wall at the back of the storage unit. Arthur Sterling appeared again. This was not the sneering, cruel man from the library video. He was sitting in this very armchair, wearing a comfortable cardigan, holding a glass of whiskey. He looked tired but lucid, and sad. "Hello, Kaylee," the video Arthur said softly. His eyes on the screen seemed to find hers in the dim light of the storage unit. Julian stopped banging on the briefcase. Beatrice crept into the unit, her hand over her mouth. "If you are watching this," Arthur continued, "it means you survived the reading. It means you had the courage to come here despite what I made the world believe about you. Forgive me for the theater back at the house, my love. It was necessary cruelly." He took a sip of whiskey and sighed. "I spent my life building an empire, Kaylee. I was a shark. I ate the weak. And in doing so, I raised sharks. Julian, Beatrice. They are exactly what I made them: ruthless, greedy, and entirely devoid of a moral compass. I knew that if I simply left you the money, they would destroy you. They would tie you up in court for decades, or worse, they'd hurt you and the baby to get what they want." On the screen, Arthur leaned forward. "I had to make them believe you were nothing. I had to make them believe I hated you, so they would lower their guard. The note in the key that was a risk. But I knew you were smart enough to figure it out." He pointed a finger at the camera. "And I knew they would follow you. Are they standing there right now?" "Kaylee, is Julian sweating, wondering where the money is? Is Beatrice worrying about her credit cards?" Julian and Beatrice stiffened, looking at the screen as if their father's ghost had physically manifested. "The money," Arthur said, a hard edge returning to his voice, "is safe. The trust is real. But who controls the trust? That depends on what happens next." Arthur held up a hand, and on the screen he placed his palm on a scanner identical to the one on the titanium briefcase sitting on the chair. "This briefcase," Arthur said, "does not contain money. It contains leverage. I call it the Sterling Protocol." Julian's face went grey. He recognized the term. It was a rumor whispered about in boardrooms, Arthur Sterling's legendary insurance policy against his enemies. Inside this case, Arthur explained, is a digital record of every dirty deal, every bribe, every illegal dump of toxic waste, every paid-off politician that built Sterling Industries. It contains the proof of Julian's insider trading in '08 that would put him in federal prison for 20 years. It contains the unredacted photos from Beatrice's incident in Monaco that we paid millions to bury. Beatrice whimpered, grabbing Julian's arm for support. It is a bomb, Arthur said calmly. A nuclear bomb that will obliterate Sterling Industries, send the stock to zero, and put my children in prison. It will destroy everything I built. Arthur looked directly into the lens, his expression softening again. Kaylee, I give this bomb to you. Your fingerprint is now coded to open this case secondary to mine. You are the executor of the Sterling Protocol. Kaylee stared at the titanium case on the chair. It wasn't a treasure chest. It was a weapon. The choice is yours, my love. Arthur's recording concluded. You can hand the company over to Julian and Beatrice and let them continue the cycle of greed. Or you can open that case, release the information to the press and the FBI, and burn it all to the ground. If you burn it down, the trust liquidates, and every remaining cent goes to charity. You will have nothing, but neither will they. Arthur smiled a sad, tired smile. I realized too late that some legacies aren't worth saving. You are the only decent thing I ever brought into this world, Kaylee. You and that baby. You decide what kind of world it grows up in. The video faded to black. The only sound in the metal unit was the drumming of rain on the roof and the ragged breathing of 3 people. Kaylee slowly stood up. She looked at the titanium case. Then she turned to look at the 2 people who had tormented her since the day she met Arthur. Julian and Beatrice were no longer the arrogant socialites in the library. They looked small, terrified. They were looking at Kaylee not as a gold digger, but as their executioner. Kaylee! Julian started, his voice cracking. The sneer was gone, replaced by desperate pleading. Kaylee, wait. Let's be rational. We were upset today. It was the grief talking. Grief, Kaylee said, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. You weren't grieving, Julian. You were counting. She walked over to the armchair and placed her hand on the handle of the titanium briefcase. Don't. Beatrice sobbed, falling to her knees in the dust. Please don't open it. Monaco, it will ruin my life. They'll take my kids away. You should have thought about that when you were wishing my baby dead back at the mansion, Kaylee said coldly. She wasn't the scared nurse anymore. Arthur had left her something more valuable than money. He had left her the power of a billionaire tyrant. And for the first time in her life, Kaylee felt the terrifying seduction of that power. She could end them. Right here, right now. The silence stretched heavy with the shift in power. Kaylee's hand hovered over the biometric scanner of the briefcase. Julian's desperation snapped. The facade of the negotiating businessman crumbled, revealing the cornered animal beneath. You won't do it, Julian hissed, taking a step toward her. You don't have the guts. You're just a nurse. You're a nobody. I'm the woman holding the match to your funeral pyre, Julian, Kaylee replied, not backing down. Listen to me. Julian's voice dropped to a menacing growl. Give me the case. Now. Nobody knows we're out here. You're pregnant alone in the Bronx. Think carefully about what happens next. The threat hung in the damp air. Beatrice looked up at her brother, alarmed by the shift in his tone. Julian, stop. Don't. Shut up, B, Julian snapped. He kept his eyes fixed on Kaylee, edging closer, blocking the exit of the storage unit. $50 million. I'll wire it to an account in the Caymans right now. You give me the case, you walk away. You and the bastard live happily ever after. Or—" He cracked his knuckles. Kaylee's heart hammered against her ribs, but Arthur's final words echoed in her mind. "Trust no one but yourself." "No," Kaylee said firmly. "I don't want your blood money. I want justice for how you treated your father. And me." "Then you get nothing." Julian lunged. It happened fast. Julian crossed the few feet between them in a violent blur. He grabbed Kaylee by the shoulders, his fingers digging cruelly into her flesh, shaking her violently. "Give it to me!" he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. Kaylee shrieked, twisting her body to protect her abdomen, dropping to the floor near the armchair, dragging the heavy titanium case down with her. "Get off me! You're hurting the baby." Beatrice was screaming now. "Julian, stop it! You're going to kill her." Julian was blinded by rage and panic. He wrenched at the briefcase that Kaylee clutched to her chest with a death grip. He raised a hand to strike her. Whoop, whoop! The blinding flash of red and blue lights suddenly flooded the open doorway of the storage unit, accompanied by the deafening chirp of police sirens. Julian froze his fist midair. "Police, drop it! Get on the ground, now!" Voices bellowed from the rain-soaked darkness outside. Julian stumbled back, hands raised, looking wildly from Kaylee to the doorway. Two uniformed NYPD officers burst into the unit guns drawn, followed closely by two large men in private security tactical gear. And walking calmly behind them, holding a large black umbrella, was Mr. Elias Thorne. The officers slammed Julian against the corrugated metal wall, cuffing him roughly. Beatrice was pulled up from the floor, sobbing hysterically. Thorne stepped into the unit, his expensive shoes avoiding the mud puddles. He looked down at Carly, who was shivering on the floor, still clutching the briefcase, tears streaming down her face. Thorne offered her a hand. His expression, usually stone-cold, was softer now, almost respectful. "Are you all right, Mrs. Sterling and the child?" I think so," Kaylee stammered, letting him help her into the armchair. "How did you know? How did you get here so fast?" Thorne adjusted his cuffs. "Arthur didn't just leave you a key, Kaylee. The envelope contained a micro-GPS tracker active only once opened. He knew Julian would chase you. He knew Julian would threaten you. Arthur anticipated every move on this chessboard." Thorne turned to where Julian was being read his rights. "Mr. Julian Sterling," Thorne said, his voice projecting clearly over Beatrice's sobbing. "By physically assaulting the court-appointed executor of the estate Kaylee, while attempting to seize estate property, you have triggered final clause 7A of Arthur's last will and testament." Julian's face pressed against the metal wall, snarled, "What clause? What are you talking about?" "The violent action clause," Thorne stated dryly. "In the event that any beneficiary uses physical force or credible threats against the executor, they are immediately and irrevocably stripped of all inheritance trusts and assets, regardless of the final disposition of the Sterling Protocol. You are now officially disinherited. You get nothing, not even the Jaguars." Julian let out a guttural roar of despair as the police dragged him toward the cruiser. Kaylee sat in the armchair in the middle of the dusty storage unit, the weight of the titanium case heavy on her lap. She watched as the flashing lights illuminated the rainy night. The vultures had been caught in the trap Arthur set, and she was the bait. But the game wasn't over. She still held the bomb, and she still had to decide whether to detonate it. The ride back from the Bronx was silent, save for the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Thorne didn't take Kaylee back to the mansion on Fairview Avenue. Instead, the convoy of black SUVs drove into the city, stopping in front of the St. Regis Hotel. "The estate is currently a crime scene," Thorne explained as the doorman held an umbrella for Kaylee. "And frankly, it's filled with ghosts. Arthur set up the presidential suite for you 3 days ago. It's paid for through the end of the year." Kaylee walked into the opulent suite, her body aching, her mind racing. The titanium briefcase sat on the marble coffee table like a dormant volcano. Thorne dismissed the security detail and poured Carly a cup of hot tea. He sat opposite her, his face weary. "Kaylee," Thorne began, "you need to understand what you are holding. Julian is gone, yes, but the Sterling Board of Directors, they are worse than Julian. Julian was incompetent and greedy. Men like Marcus Vance and Silas O'Connell, they are competent and ruthless. They will try to take the company from you tomorrow morning." Kaylee touched the cold metal of the case. "Arthur said I could burn it down. I could release these files." "You could." Thorne nodded. "If you scan your fingerprint and enter the code, the files automatically upload to the servers of the New York Times, the SEC, and the FBI. Sterling Industries will cease to exist within 24 hours. The stock will hit zero. The assets will be seized." "And the people?" Kaylee asked softly. "Not the board. The real people. The factory workers in Ohio. The drivers, the administrative assistants." Thorne sighed. 20,000 people will lose their jobs instantly. Their pensions will be wiped out. It will be an economic catastrophe for innocent families. Kaylee closed her eyes. This was the final trap. Arthur had given her the weapon to destroy his enemies, but using it would make her a monster just like him. He was testing her humanity, even from the grave. "He knew I wouldn't do it," Kaylee whispered. "He knew I couldn't hurt innocent people just to get revenge on his family." "Arthur was a complicated man," Thorne said. "He regretted the way he made his money, but he didn't know how to stop. He left the brake pedal to you." Kaylee opened her eyes. They were hard, flinty. She wasn't the weeping widow anymore. She was a mother protecting her child's future legacy. "I won't burn it down, Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time. "But I won't let the vultures have it either. Arthur said this case contains leverage, proof of crimes." "It does," Thorne confirmed. "Detailed records of embezzlement, bribery, and fraud committed by almost every member of the current board." "Then I don't need to destroy the company," Kaylee said, sitting up straighter. "I need to clean it." "That is a dangerous path," Thorne warned. "If you walk into that boardroom tomorrow and threaten them, they will come for you with everything they have. Lawyers hit pieces in the press, private investigators." Kaylee placed her hand on her stomach. The baby kicked a strong, rhythmic thump. "Let them come," she said. "Julian treated me like trash because I was poor. Arthur treated me like a pawn because I was naive. Nobody has ever treated me like a CEO. It's time they learned." She looked at the briefcase. "Show me how to open it without uploading the files to the press. I need to print them." Thorne smiled a slow, predatory smile that showed why he was the best lawyer in the city. "Now you sound like a Sterling." The storm had cleared by morning, leaving the Manhattan skyline scrubbed clean and bright. But inside the boardroom on the 50th floor of the Sterling Tower, the atmosphere was thunderous. 12 men in grey suits sat around the long glass table. At the head sat Marcus Vance, the CFO, a man with eyes like a shark and a smile like a razor blade. "The situation with Julian is unfortunate," Vance said, smoothing his tie. "But it simplifies things. With Julian in custody and disinherited, And the widow, clearly unstable and unfit, the control of the company, naturally falls to the board, acting as emergency trustees. "We need to issue a statement," said Silas O'Connell, the COO. "Paint the widow as overwhelmed. Offer her a settlement to go away quietly. If she fights, we release the story that she seduced a dying man for his money. We destroy her character before she even steps foot in the building." The doors to the boardroom didn't just open, they were pushed wide with authority. "I don't think that will be necessary, gentlemen," a voice rang out. Kaylee Sterling walked in. She wore a tailored white suit that Martha had rush-delivered from the manor that morning. It was sharp, professional, and commanding. She looked nothing like the trailer park girl Victoria had mocked. Thorne walked a step behind her, carrying the titanium briefcase. Vance stood up, his face reddening. "Mrs. Sterling, this is a closed meeting. Security." "Sit down, Marcus," Kaylee said. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her voice had the icy calm of a woman holding a loaded gun. She walked to the head of the table. Vance hesitated, then seeing the look in Thorne's eyes, slowly sank back into his chair. Kaylee stood at the head of the table. She didn't sit. She looked at each man in turn. "You were planning to buy me out," Kaylee stated, "or destroy my reputation. Which one was it going to be today?" "We are trying to save the company, Kaylee," O'Connell said condescendingly. "You are a nurse. You don't know the first thing about running a multinational conglomerate. You have no experience, no education in this field. And frankly, you are emotional." "You're right," Kaylee said. "I don't know how to launder money through shell companies in Panama, Silas. But according to these files..." She nodded to Thorne. He opened the briefcase and slid a single file folder down the long glass table. It spun perfectly, stopping right in front of Silas O'Connell. Silas opened it, his face drained of color. "That is a record of the wire transfers you authorized from the pension fund to your private account in Zurich," Kaylee said. "Arthur kept receipts. For everything." The room went deathly silent. Thorne slid another folder. This one stopped in front of Vance. "And Marcus," Kaylee continued, "the environmental impact reports for the Dakota pipeline. The ones you paid the inspectors to falsify, that's federal fraud. 10 years in prison, minimum." One by one, folders were distributed. Every man at the table had a secret. Every man had a price. And Arthur Sterling had owned them all. "This is blackmail," Vance hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. "No," Kaylee corrected. "This is a transition of power." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I am the executor of the Sterling Protocol. I hold the digital keys. If I don't check in with a secure server every 24 hours, these files go public automatically. If anything happens to me, if I have an accident, if I get sued, if bad press leaks about me, the files go public." She leaned in. "So here is how this is going to work. You are all going to resign. Effective immediately. You will keep your pensions, but you will sign non-disclosure agreements, and you will leave this building. If you fight me, I press the button, and you all go to jail." "You can't fire the whole board," O'Connell shouted. "The stock will tank, the company will collapse, the stock will dip," Kaylee admitted. "But then I will appoint a new board, a board of ethical, transparent leaders, and we will rebuild Sterling Industries into something Arthur was too afraid to create, an honest company." She looked at Vance. "Well, Marcus, do you want to leave with your dignity and your freedom? Or do you want to leave in handcuffs like Julian?" Vance looked at the folder. He looked at the fierce determination in the eyes of the pregnant woman he had underestimated. He realized the game was over. The king was dead. Long live the queen. He closed the folder. I'll have my resignation on your desk in 10 minutes. Good, Kaylee said. And on your way out, tell your secretaries they all just got a 20% raise. 5 years later. The iron gates of 440 Fairview Avenue, which had once stood as jagged teeth barring the world from the Sterling family's secrets, were wide open. The gloomy, rain-slicked atmosphere of that fateful funeral reception was a distant memory. Today, the estate was bathed in golden sunlight, and the air was filled not with the whispers of conspirators, but with the sound of a string quartet and the laughter of 300 guests. It was the 5th annual Sterling Future Gala, an event that had become the highlight of the New York social calendar. But unlike the parties of Arthur's era, this wasn't a display of vanity. It was a celebration of the massive philanthropic work the company now led. Kaylee Sterling stood on the limestone terrace, looking down at the manicured gardens. At 32, she was breathtaking. The uncertainty and fear that had plagued her during the will reading were gone, replaced by the poised, steel-spined elegance of a woman who had faced down wolves and emerged as the alpha. She wore a simple but stunning emerald gown, her hair swept back, watching a small boy chase a golden retriever through the rose bushes. He looks more like Arthur every day, a voice said beside her. Kaylee turned to smile at Elias Thorne. The lawyer's hair was completely white now, but his face was less guarded. He had transitioned from the family's fixer to Kaylee's most trusted advisor and the boy's godfather. He has Arthur's eyes, Kaylee agreed, watching her son, 4-year-old Arthur James A.J. Sterling II, tumble into the grass, giggling. But he has my heart. He'll never know the coldness that raised his father. You've done a remarkable thing, Kaylee, Thorne said, taking a sip of iced tea. The quarterly earnings call is tomorrow. Sterling Industries stock is up 40% since the pivot to green energy. The boardroom massacre, as the papers still call it, was the best thing to ever happen to this company. Kylie nodded slowly. It hadn't been easy. The first 2 years were a war of attrition. She had purged the rot, fired the sycophants, and withstood the media storms. But she had held on to the Sterling protocol, the titanium briefcase, like a nuclear deterrent. She never had to release the files. The threat alone kept the enemies at bay until she had built enough legitimate power to no longer need them. Have we heard from him? Kaylee asked quietly. Thorne didn't need to ask who she meant. Julian's parole hearing was denied last week. He's still in Otisville. He sends letters mostly blaming you for his misfortune, though occasionally he asks for money for the commissary. Beatrice is still in Zurich. She spends her allowance quietly. She knows better than to wake the dragon. Good, Kaylee said, her voice devoid of malice, but firm with resolve. Let them stay in the past. She excused herself and walked inside, the heels of her shoes clicking on the marble floors that used to intimidate her. She made her way to the library, the room where it had all begun. The room where she was given $1 and told to get out. The heavy oak desk was still there, but the air of intimidation was gone. The shelves were now filled with photos of AJ, colorful finger paintings and architectural models of the new schools the foundation was building. Carly walked to the fireplace and looked up at the massive portrait of Arthur. She had never taken it down, but she had added a small brass plaque to the frame. A lesson in resilience. She reached into the top drawer of the desk and pulled out a small glass-framed object. Inside was that original crumpled $1 bill. You were wrong, Arthur. she whispered to the painted eyes of her late husband. You thought you had to break me to save me. You thought I needed to become a monster to survive your world. She traced the glass frame with her finger. I didn't become you. I didn't burn it down. I fixed it. Arthur had left her a trap, expecting her to either be crushed by his family or destroyed by her own vengeance. Instead, she had dismantled the trap and used the parts to build a fortress. She had proven that a nurse from New Jersey had more grit in her little finger than the entire Sterling dynasty combined. Mama. AJ ran into the library, his knees stained with grass, holding a flower he had plucked from the garden. For you. Kaylee crouched down, ignoring the expensive gown, and scooped her son into a hug, burying her face in his neck. This was the real inheritance. Not the billions, not the buildings, but the safety to raise a child who would be kind, who would be loved, and who would never ever have to sit in a cold room and beg for his worth. Kaylee stood up, holding her son, and looked one last time at the dollar bill. She smiled, turned off the library lights, and walked back out into the sun. And that is how Kaylee Sterling turned a single dollar and a cruel joke into an empire. Arthur thought he was leaving her a test of cruelty, but Kaylee proved that integrity is the most powerful leverage of all. She didn't just survive the shark tank. She drained the water and built a garden. It goes to show that sometimes when people try to bury you, they don't realize you are a seed. Julian and the board underestimated the nurse, and they paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. What would you have done if you were in Kaylee's shoes? Would you have burned the company down to the ground, or would you have tried to save it like she did? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and revenge, please smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching.